And good afternoon. I'm David Friedman. I'm co-host for TCA Venture Group's TCA Crossroads with my co-host, friend, and colleague, Dave Burkus. Hi, Dave. How are you doing today?
Hey, David. I'm doing great. It's a good day, and so let's have a little fun today.
I totally agree. I'm looking in the in back of you. I see the little Tony the Tiger. I guess you like Frosted Flakes. So did I as a kid, actually. But
Well, that's my college that I'm still a trustee of after 49 years, and so that is the Tiger for Occidental College.
for which college?
Occidental College in Los Angeles.
Oh, you see, I had it as Clemson.
Oh, well, we copied Princeton. So if you want to play the game
Oh,
that
I
way,
forgot about them.
same color, same songs, same Tiger, same everything. But I
Boy,
didn't say that.
that tiger gets around. And so
You
do
eat
we,
it.
by the way. I'm real excited about today
Okay.
because last time we did an episode on talking about what entrepreneurs disregard
We
when
did.
they look for funding and when they look for help. Today, we're going to flip it around and we're going to talk about the 10 keys for business success. But it also applies very directly to startup success. And the reason why I was kidding about your background is because when you're a startup, that's kind of what the background looks like. You have stuff all around,
Messy.
messy, you
Mhm.
know. But so I understand you have prepared some really cool slides for the viewers, and we're going to go through them.
Sure.
I'm going
Okay,
to
you
go
ready?
pop them up.
Hit that button.
I got
So
it.
today we're going to give you 10 tests for business success. How's that? Okay,
Sounds
so here
good.
we go. Number one, big one. Is your market identifiable and accessible? Can you hit something that's bigger than a tiny, tiny niche? Because if you can't, investors aren't going to be very interested, and your plan probably won't be very expansive. David?
Yeah, as a marketing engineer turned marketeer, this is really critical. It's the ability to focus, and that's really critical as entrepreneurs need to be able to use their money wisely. So identifying a clear market and literally saying, I can actually see that customer, what that customer looks like, their psychographic behavior, how do I find them becomes really critical. Without that, you have really no point to start.
Well said. Very academic. Number two, the industry cycle. Where are you in that industry cycle? If you're late, it doesn't much matter. There's probably a lot of other competition. If you're very early, if you're too early, you're probably going to find early adopters. If you're right there in the middle, you've crossed the chasm. You probably have a real chance of doing something right. Industry life cycle.
Yeah, so I met Jeffrey Moore years and years ago when Crossing the
There you
Chasm
are.
became big, and I still believe that that concept applies. But what is interesting too was when we did our surveys of technology earlier this year at TCA Venture Group, we looked at things that were early on and things that would have staying power. So like precision medicine, AI, looking at molecules, new materials. So it makes a difference for the entrepreneur because that entrepreneur has to go to that angel group that deals in those industries and at that life cycle stage. Because
Yep.
even though we're angels taking risks, not all of us like to take that same level of risk.
Well said. So here's one you might have guessed. How about the size of the market? How large is that total market? Now, here's one where you and I may disagree a bit, but I like to think of TAM, SAM, SOM, total available market, serviceable available market, and serviceable obtainable market. What can your company reach to obtain with whatever resources it needs to do it? And if you can figure that market to be, pick a number, 50 million, and you want to have 25 million of the 50, can you get 50%? Big question, and one that we investors would like to ask. Because if you're a tiny market, like I happen to be a bicycle shop on the main street of town, and therefore I can take 100% of that market with no competition, that's not interesting to us.
So we as investors, massification. and that is the ability to grow into a larger market. Now,
Yes.
I'm different, but I don't really care about listening to the TAM, SAM, and SUM to a point. I am concerned about the SUM because it tells me how you're going to build your business to that revenue stream, like the SUM is your 5-year goal or your 3-year goal, whatever you define it. But I have heard, and I'm sure you have too in many pitches, where the entrepreneur says, and we're in the AI market, and that AI market is going to represent $6 trillion. And my SUM in 5 years is going to be $35 million. There, to me, is a disconnect.
Little disconnect. And yes, I've heard that too.
Yeah.
I've heard the opposite. And I've used this before, maybe even on this podcast. It's the gloves in China syndrome. Let's see, I have 2 gloves I'm going to sell. There are 1 billion 2 people in China. If I get 1% of that market with my 2 gloves, let me see. That is, I don't want to figure it out, but you got the idea. So the next question is, can you dominate that market? And I gave you the example of the bicycle shop that was situated on the main street of town. Well, sure, you might be able to dominate that market. And you gave the example of the AI company. Can you dominate that industry? Well, not likely. So that's the question we've got to ask the potential company, as if we're investors looking at you as a candidate to invest. Can you dominate that market? David, what do you think?
Yeah, that's always a tricky one because when you say dominate, when I came from a large company, when you say dominate, you also have, Sherman and Clayton antitrust, bells ringing in your brain. I don't think the startups have to worry about that. But in dominating the market, I think we want to understand from an investor point of view, how are you going to do that? Is it going to be your people? Is it going to be processes? Is it going to be your IP? Is it going to be your brand? And it's okay to be the chimpanzee or the number 2 or 3 player. Better to be the gorilla or the number 1 player. But the question is, how much is it going to cost for you to get there? Now, we'd certainly rather invest in the gorilla, but if you're a good, strong chimpanzee, that you have carved out going back to your number 1 point, a market niche within the overall market, I think we're okay with that.
Nicely said. Number 5 kind of relates to this. Have you been able to create barriers to entry? Or on the other side, are you a me too? If you've created good enough barriers to entry, that's a great thing for a business plan. And just prove it. Make sure that other people can't copy your idea, or at least do something that parallels your idea.
So I was thinking about barriers to entry as well, because the question in my mind as an investor is, can you have a sustainable differential advantage? And a barrier to entry gives you that sustainability, at least to a point, and maybe over several years. So when I look at barriers to entry, I'm looking at things like IP. Maybe you have IP for this cancer drug, or maybe you have IP for the next great chip that you're going to dethrone NVIDIA. Kind of doubt it, but you never know. You have brand as a barrier to entry, but that costs you a lot of money. So if somebody's saying our brand is going to create the barrier, we have to see it in the financial plan, and that may be somewhat difficult. And then distribution. If I'm a frozen food company, do I have a partnership with Green Giant or Birdseye to be able to get the shelf space? If I don't, how are you going to get a barrier? But the one thing that I don't want to hear is that we have the greatest team in the world right now, and those people are the barriers to entry. That's true, but that raises a whole bunch of issues, is like, how are you going to continue to build the team? How are you going to keep the team? And what happens if they leave? So that's a very critical point, though. And that's one of the keys and the risk elements that I believe is necessary to investigate.
Well said. And this is one that I think is important. Are your margins enough to be able to sustain and grow this business? Most of the time, early businesses have a very low margin, and that's not necessarily good. Where my opinion is, if you're an early entrant with a great product, sometimes high margins are available to you early before competition attacks. And so it's usually the opposite of what people often think.
But when I look at margins, what I really want to understand is when those margins change over time. So, for example, if the strategy of the business is to get as many eyeballs, get as many customers as you want, get as many reference sell, and I'm going to purposefully reduce my margins initially to do penetration pricing, that's one thing. If they don't have an understanding of the strategy behind how they're going to get their margins, and if they don't have an overall plan to reduce their margin through more lean manufacturing, offshoring, different storage facilities, then I am concerned. So margins represents a good keyword that drives me into different directions to probe during due diligence.
Well said. And let's refer back to one of our previous editions of Crossroads. We talked about pricing and positioning. We talked about margins, predatory pricing, lots of different ways in which pricing and margins are important. Number 7, can this business grow to be over 20 million in gross revenues within 5 years? Because if not, you really shouldn't be seeking investments from other than from friends and family. It's an important test, and it's one that you ought to be thinking about yourself. Because again, you can dominate a tiny market if you're the only bicycle shop on the street, but that's not enough for an investor, and it may not be enough for you and your vision for a business and its success.
Yeah, so this is where I'm a growth kind of I'm a growth hacker. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
I like growth. I was offered the job one time to be in charge of a product line called Telex, if you remember that in your history books. And I declined it because I didn't think it would be appropriate for my career to manage a business into oblivion. So I left. But with growth. But here's the key on growth that I see, and I don't think a lot of entrepreneurs get this. There are routes to revenue. What are your routes to revenue? How are you going to make money? What product lines? Number 2, how are you going to take your product and grow in different markets? You have a product here in one market. I'm in the aerospace market. I have a product that's called screws maybe. And how am I going to take it into the industrial market from an aerospace market? Maybe it's different. Maybe it's the same. Maybe it's different quality control standards. I don't know. And finally, do I grow by looking at product development? In other words, now I'm in this market. I have this product, and now I have screws in the aerospace market, but now I want to do wingtips or I want to do seats. Not necessarily maybe the smartest thing to do, but I need to understand what my growth vectors are.
Very good. And there's one for another future broadcast of TCA Crossroads, because that alone could mean something important.
Correct.
Number 8, and here's one we all have to concentrate on. Do you actually have a world-class management team? Because if you do, that management team will help you when almost always you need to pivot off of the original business plan. And number 2, the management team needs to be broad enough to have somebody in marketing, somebody in technology, somebody in general management. If it's a product, inventory management, perhaps, just so many ways in which that management team can make this business fail if not broad enough.
Yeah, you probably, you did a really good episode on boards, I think, at one time. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's not only the operational management team, but it's the advisory boards and it's the other groups that you put together to help support that management team. One thing that these companies, the entrepreneurs, need to look at is key man insurance or key person insurance to make sure that we keep and sustain and grow these people. You don't want to see a lot of churn in your business. That would be a big red flag and a risk element if all of a sudden that management team had turned over 3 times in 4 years. That is a clue that there's something amiss there. And finally, going back to our prior episode when we talked about what entrepreneurs don't listen to, they need to be able to look at the smart money that the investors bring, the angel investors bring, and supplement their management team with maybe a board observer or a board person from the angel group that can help them sustain and grow their business to get back to number 7 on growth potential.
And so it is true that most intelligent investors look at the team before anything else, because usually the pivot is going to be assumed. And if it's true that we have a good team, we assume that they'll understand how and begin to execute a pivot. If you don't, you're going to live and die on the sword by the original idea. And that's not typically the one that survives.
That's right.
Number 9, do you have a compelling product? Did your idea that you described when you first started this business translate into a compelling product? Some ideas just can't be made into a product at a reasonable enough price to attract customers. And that's a question that we have to be able to ask sometimes by going to the market with a wireframe or any kind of a prototype that would give us some kind of response. Do we have a compelling product? David?
Yeah. So again, this goes back to marketing, because markets are consists of multiple customers. There are two things that I'd like to add to the compelling product. Number one is, do you talk from an entrepreneur's point of view? Do you talk to your customers on a regular basis? Do you have them as touch points? So you have your product out there and you have the customer comment. We called it, when I was at ATX Group, which did telematics for the high-end cars, a living lab. We brought people in. Does this work? Does this not work? How does it work? Edsel, going back a long way, when the Edsel was manufactured, they actually asked people what they liked and didn't like, wound up with an Edsel, different problem. But the problem was the development cycle was so long, they kind of went by that. And finally, with a compelling product, I really, as an investor, want to know what their product roadmap looks like, because that gets back down to, do I have a platform for that product, or I have a singular product? Is it WD-40, or is it an infrastructure like an AI infrastructure that can be applicable for different products and different markets for growth?
That's a good one. Okay. And number 10, and the final one is, what is your exit strategy? Because, if you have a professional service business, like a doctor or a dentist or any other kind of consulting practice, there is no real exit strategy for any of those, because they're based upon the personalities. But if you happen to have a product that could be worth millions, or a SaaS, SaaS business that gives you a lot of opportunity for high growth and therefore for high valuation, we, the investors, want to be able to talk about that. Big difference, and one that you ought to be compelling in your understanding of it. It's worth a complete episode of TCA Crossroads to talk about nothing except exit strategy. David?
Yeah, we're not in this for the just the fun. Most of us investing are in it for the returns. And yeah, it's unfortunate, but we're not just philanthropists in this venture. This is our making money so we can be philanthropists kind of venture. But when each of the angel groups has a different investment thesis, each one has a different thinking about what it would take for an exit. We know that, for example, TCA Orange County is looking at deals that are going to give us a 10x return over a period of time. Let's say, and again, we go back to a comment you made in a prior episode. I think it was the last episode. We talk about 1202. We want to see that exit in 5 years and 1 day. We get the advantages of a tax break. But the exit strategy also affects your funding strategy. Do you need additional funds? When are you going to exit? What is your multiple? Each market segment, each market, each industry, where you are in that life cycle will all affect where the exit is, the amount of the exit, and the multiple of that exit. So you almost have to begin with the end in mind when you present. If you're an entrepreneur, you should think about what the investor wants. We want a return of X in a certain percentage of time. Your story should say, how do we get there? And let me tell you that story of why we believe we will do that. Just another thought. It's almost like Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind.
And there is a possibility for another episode of TCA Crossroads, how to tell your story and why telling stories is the most compelling single way of getting good investors and getting good people to come along with your vision. So, David, I think we probably have wrapped it up. And if not, we could go on for hours, but I think this may not be the appropriate thing to do. Back to you.
No, but you've given me a lot more work. Now I have to figure out how to get the people for becoming a guest in one of these 16 episodes you now, just pulled off the top of your head. But they're really to me, they're very interesting topics. And I think both you and I and other people within our networks will be willing to help share advice that can help the entrepreneur be better building that business and help the investor do better in their due diligence, asking the right questions so they can get the final, those really successful returns that they so desire.
That's a good tease for future episodes. But right now, I think we need to wrap it up, David.
All right. So on behalf of Dave Burkus and David Friedman, thank you for joining. We hope this information was useful, and let us know if you like it. But I want to remind you, like, subscribe, and communicate with us. This is for you. We're doing these because we believe in the ecosystem. We believe in helping the entrepreneur. We believe in helping all the investors, regardless of where they are, get their results that they so desire. So for now, have a good evening. Goodbye.